Then let me go ahead and introduce I guess we'll go ahead and get started then. Let me go ahead and introduce our speaker for today. So we have Dr. Jose Esteban Hernandez, who's coming to talk to us. He's from here at UTRGV in our Department of Spanish. So once you've taken all of your English linguistics courses, and you still want to take more linguistics courses, you can go over to Spanish and take a bunch of Spanish linguistics courses with them. He's a professor of Hispanic linguistics here, as we said. His research interests include sociolinguistic variation, dialect and language contact in U.S. setting, and the study of discourse analysis and discourse markers. Most recently, he's focused on language and identity issues under language contact situations, and his main interests lie in understanding the interface of the complex social and linguistic issues that affect small language minorities in the diaspora. He's authored in venues such as Journal of Sociolinguistics, Studies in Hispanic and Lusophone Linguistics, Bulletin of Hispanic Studies, Revista Internacional de Lingüística Iberoamericana, Revista Española de Lingüística, Lengua y Migración Boreales, an International Journal of Hispanic Linguistics, SEMAS, and Southwest Journal of Linguistics. He's taught courses on the dynamics of language variation and change and the sociolinguistics of US and Latino communities. And please welcome Dr. Hernandez.
Thank you for that introduction, Dr. Foreman, and thank you, Dr. Christopherson, for hosting this very important forum for us here in UTRGV. It's always nice to come and present my work here. And so thank you also to all of you, because you're the guys that you're the ones that really make this happen. If you weren't here, there would be nobody to present to, all right? But I think I presented something on Chino Mexicanos before. So this is like another installment of several papers that I've written on the topic. And here you can see a picture of part of what's called La Chinesca. And La Chinesca is in Mexicali. So the data that I am using for this particular study comes from Mexicali, Baja California. And also, well, the title is The Effect of Priming on Liquid and On-Target and Off-Target Production in the Second Language Spanish of Chinese Origin Participants. So in this case, I will be focusing on the acquisition of a second language, in this case, the acquisition of Spanish as a second language by people who speak originally as a native language, Cantonese, which is a Chinese language. Some of them are also trilingual, because some of them have learned Mandarin as well. Before immigrating to Mexico, they learned Mandarin in school, or they've learned Mandarin in Mexicali, because there are several schools in Mexicali where they can go and acquire this Mandarin, okay? And so mainly the presentation is to look at the effect of, my idea is to look at the effect of priming on linguistic competence, and I will explain a little bit what I mean by priming. Some of you may have heard this in one of your linguistic course. And then I'm also looking at linguistic competence of L2 learners, like I said before. One of the things that makes my study different from other studies that you may have seen is that I'm using what's called natural data. In other words, these are people that are acquiring their Spanish not in the classroom, but in a natural setting. I mean, and I don't mean that a classroom is not a natural setting. It is like a community of practice, and those are important, but these people don't necessarily have any formal education in their second language. Okay? So that, I think it's important, because it also gives us like a piece of the puzzle for those of us who study second language acquisition. Okay, so I'm trying to account for the production of on-target and what I call off-target variance. And I'm using the word variance very lightly, because this is not necessarily a variational study, even though it is quantitative. And so I'm also looking at phonology, the sounds. I'm looking at sounds, and I'm looking at how these people of Chinese origin are producing the language that they're acquiring in the community. And so I'm looking at one specific group of sounds, which are called liquids. And mainly liquids, if you speak Spanish, I'm talking about rhotics or vibrants, R, and also laterals, L. So basically what's represented in writing with R's and with L's, okay? Even though, as we will see, these people are producing other sounds when they're articulating other sounds when they're trying to produce these liquids, okay? So liquids is like an umbrella term that I'm using, and it's very commonly used, okay? So I'm looking at the effect of priming on the data that I am analyzing. This is Mexico. And so we are here on this part of Texas by the Gulf of America. And Mexicali is in the opposite side by the Pacific. This is Mexicali right here, would be here, Baja California. You can see Mexicali is here, so it's pretty close to Tijuana. Even though it's pretty close, it's about a good 2 or 3 hours drive because there's a lot of mountains that you have to cross before getting to Tijuana, to the Pacific. Okay, so there's Mexicali. And okay, and so that's where I was gathering the data that I will be using for these study. A little bit about the Chino Mexicanos in Mexicali. Mexicali was founded in the mid-1800s. Baja California, I don't know how much of the history of Mexico and the population of the northern part of Mexico, but Baja California was colonized. Well, was not colonized by the Spaniards, but it was the Mexican government after independence started trying to develop the area. And so it didn't really take on pretty well. And it took a while for that to happen. But mainly the foundation of settlements in Baja California started occurring by the late 1800s, early 1900s. And it was mainly because of, it was a lot because of Chinese immigration. Okay, so like the first persons that came to Mexicali in great numbers were the Chinese, and they were mainly there because they were working for American cotton companies that were recruiting people in China and that were recruiting people from the United States. And so the settlement of Baja California really started taking off after the Chinese in the US began having problems because there were several Chinese exclusion acts which stopped Chinese immigration at some point, but then also which repealed any Chinese living in the US, whether they were American citizens or born in the US or not. And so a lot of them saw northern Mexico as a good option to returning to China, which they really had no connection to. Okay. So in studying this L2 acquisition, I'm going to focus on the off-target articulation that is produced during L2 acquisition. And so when we start studying second language acquisition, when we start learning a language, for example, I took some courses in French, I took some courses in Portuguese, and I made a lot of mistakes, right? I made a lot of mistakes. So those mistakes are what I'm calling off-target articulations. So when we speak a second language, and if we are new, relatively new, we make mistake, and that's something that it's expected in a way, and then we kind of work right towards perfection or towards better development of the second language. But in many cases, with the natural acquisition, what happens is that these second language that these people are acquiring becomes somewhat fossilized. Okay, so it stays at a certain stage and it doesn't develop any further. I'm not saying that these people are there. Actually, what I found with the Chino Mexicanos is that they have a lot of on-target production. And so I'll discuss that in a minute. Okay, what else? And so I'm looking at off-target articulation because they diverge from monolingual models. And mostly I'm looking at interference. Okay, so interference would be what carries on to the second language from the first language. In this case, that would be Cantonese, but also some from Mandarin. Okay. Okay, so L1 in the production of L2. I think that's most of what I can say. Okay. And so these Chinese immigration in Mexico. Okay. If you start looking at old movies, old novels, you start reading novels in Mexico, you'll find that sometimes you will find characters of Chinese origin, and there's always like a parody of the way that they spoke. Okay, so I'm talking about early literature, Mexican literature from the early 20th century, late 19th century. You will find in this literature, you will find characters of Chinese origin. There are also, you will also find these parodies in songs, in music from that period. And even there's a lot of jokes, very racist jokes about these, the way that these Chinese were trying to speak. And you will also find them in movies from the el siglo de oro, no, el cine de oro mexicano, cine de oro mexicano, because these were an important population up to the possibly about to the 1930s, 1940s. There were still prominent populations in the northern part of Mexico and in Mexico City and in some other coastal towns in the Pacific. Okay, and so basically what happens is when you see these parodies, a lot of those focus on lateralization. Lateralization is when an R becomes an L in speech. So for example, pero can become perro. Pero, okay. Perro can become pelo. El perro, el pelo. Pero el perro, ¿verdad? That can also become pelo, el pelo. ¿Sí? And so what happens in those parodies that I was talking about, and if you look at that literature, those R's will always become L's. I mean, it's categorical. It doesn't reflect what seems to be happening in Mexicali. So what was recorded there, even in the movies, if you have a Chinese origin character, that character would always lateralize those Rothics, those R's, okay? So I'm trying to see if that's happening in Mexicali as well, okay? Okay, so, and this is interesting because this doesn't happen in L1 varieties in northern Mexico. We know that in Caribbean Spanish, some of these may become lateralized, correct? La puerta, la puerta, la carne, la calne, and those happen mainly in syllable final context, correct? Phonological context, right? If you heard somebody from the Caribbean, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, you may find this. La puerta, la carne, etc. And it's also in variation. In other words, it doesn't happen categorically, right? It's determined by social factors, linguistic factors, etc. ¿De acuerdo? Okay. And so here, I am looking at, I am considering things like lugar, as off target, because it doesn't really happen in the L1 varieties. Somebody did a similar study in Cuba, and he found that in Cuba, people did seem, in oral speech, did seem to be producing a lot of lateralization, okay? But in Cuba, there is lateralization in syllable final R. So maybe the fact that the Cubans already produce syllable final lateralization of Rothics helped the lateralization in other contexts to an almost categorically, okay? All right. All right, a little bit about the Chinese languages. I'm focusing on Cantonese. It is a Chinese language. I don't know how much you know about China, but there is no such thing as a Chinese language, but there are Chinese languages. There are many languages spoken in China. The language that I'm talking about here is Cantonese, which is spoken in the Hong Kong, Guangdong, Macau area, which is the area that received more colonization from Europe, more European colonization. This is where the Portuguese settled, where they founded Macau, where the English settled, Hong Kong, and also Guangdong, where they had a lot of influence. And so in the early 1900s, late 1800s, mainly the people coming to the United States, Mexico, other parts of Latin America, the Caribbean, places like Cuba, they were coming from this area, from the southern part of China. From the southern part of China, it's not next to Vietnam, but it's pretty close to Vietnam, in case if you can. So this is just one of the many languages that are spoken in China, okay? But Mandarin is the national language, obviously. Mandarin is a national language. If you went to school in China, like around the 1960s, from around the 1960s, you would have learned Mandarin. If you went to school before that, which is the case for many people in Mexicali, you do not learn Mandarin. Okay, so if somebody immigrated to Mexicali before the 1960s, more than likely that person will not be speaking Mandarin. But if you did, after the 1960s, more than likely that person would speak Cantonese as a native language, as an L1, Mandarin as an L2, and then Spanish as an L3, okay? And apparently if you read a Mandarin newspaper, you can understand something, but it's not 100%, you cannot understand 100% because there's also syntactic structures that may not transfer, and other type of structures that may not transfer. But anyway, some of the phonological traits of Cantonese. Okay, like Mandarin is a tonal language, but I think Mandarin has 3 tones, which I'm not going to try to I think you might be able to give us an example of tonal language, but because Zapotec is a tonal language. How many tones does it have?
6, maybe?
6, okay. So Mandarin has, I think, 3 tones, and Mandarin has around 7, I think. 6 which are working, and 1 which is kind of like becoming obsolete. Okay, so tonally, it's much more complex than Mandarin. Okay, most of the syllables are consonant vowel, CV, CV, CV. So Spanish is close, but not necessarily canonically consonant vowel. So la casa, consonant vowel, consonant vowel, consonant vowel. But we do have complex constructions, right? Like tres, trabajo. Those are complex. So those do not occur in Chinese languages. So those complex clusters are not going to occur. Okay. Syllable final. Most of the consonants that we have in Spanish appear syllable initial in Chinese. Okay, in Chinese languages, Cantonese as well. But then a lot of the syllable final contrastive consonants that we have in Spanish are not going to occur in Cantonese. Okay, most of them translate to Mandarin as well. So there's not going to be a word ending with a P, with a T, with a K, with an N, with an N in Cantonese. But in Spanish, we do have many, right? I mean, there's a tendency to delete those as well. Like reloj can become reloj, mi reloj. La pared, ¿verdad? Right, so there's that tendency, but I mean, we tend to pronounce them when we're talking, like, more formal context, etc. The consonant clusters are not possible, and then the lateral sounds are going to occur only in syllable initial position. So Lugar. No. I'm trying to find a word that ends with an L. That's not going to be possible in Cantonese. In Spanish, I'm trying to find for a word that ends with an L in Spanish.
Tamal.
Tamal. So that's not going to be possible in Cantonese. So there's no syllable final ladders. They only occur in syllable initial positions. Obviously, they're not going to occur in some consonant clusters. Okay, and then the vibrant sounds are all but absent. There's no vibrant sounds in Cantonese. There's no rhotics. So they don't have anything like R. They don't have anything like R, or even that retroflex that we have in English, like red. That's not happening in standard varieties, even though it does happen in non-standard varieties. So it's kind of like a change that's happening in Mandarin, not in Cantonese, but in Mandarin. So in Mandarin, you will have like that R like in red, red. Okay. I think I talked a little bit about that. And so basically in Spanish, we have those phonemes, the lateral, le, which are contrastive, right? Contrasting means that we have pero, perro, pelo. The change in sound gives us the sound, gives us a change in meaning, correct? Pelo, pero, perro. Pelo, perro, pelo, perro, pero. Okay, right. And then the other thing is that in Spanish, the rhotic at the end of a syllable can be pronounced in several ways, right? Por ejemplo, carne. It can be produced as a tap, carne. It could be produced as a trill, carne. And in Caribbean, it can be produced as a lateral, calne. And even in other parts of the Caribbean, for example, in the Dominican Republic, caine. That R can turn into a vowel, caine. El mal. What am I saying? El mal. El mal. El mal. Right. I had to think about it. Yes, and in Cuba, it can turn into a geminate. Canne. So there's something about that those rhotics at the end of a syllable. And so here I'm considering those separately than the other three phonemes. It's not a phoneme though. It's an archiphonema. I don't know how you say that in English, but it's an archiphonema. So these are some examples of the things that I found. For example, I found, okay, and these are off target. Okay, these are off target. And sorry, but I don't have the sound. Oportunidad para entrar a escuela. Escuela. There's no la there. There's no article. Oportunidad para entrar a la escuela. Ya tiene familia aquí. Can you make the translation? Can you guys make the translation? Ellos gusta la familia grande. Antes legaba para la cliente. Okay, there's several things that are happening at the syntactic level, obviously, but I'm looking at the phonological. And then there's retroflex, mucho lluvio y mucho arroz. And so this is happening mainly with people that speak Mandarin. So this, assuming it's an interference from Mandarin. Mucho arroz, Cantonese y Mandarin, China. And then the other thing is that there's deletion of that syllable final rhotic, porque el 70 y platicar mucho. So there's several ways that these participants are trying to solve. I don't know if it's a problem, but solve these differences between their L2 and their L1. Right? One of them is by going into lateralization or rhoticisms or deletion. Okay, and that deletion, what happens is that they produce a CV structure, correct? CV, even though there's an N right there. But I think that's what they're trying to do. So platicar turns into platicar. Platicar. Okay? Okay, what's priming? What is priming? Okay, what do you guys think priming is? Do you have any idea? Well, don't read what's there. What's priming? What would you think if I say it's going to prime you? It's a cognitive effect, okay? Mainly it's a cognitive effect that it doesn't happen only in phonology. For example, if I say salt and finish the salt and pepper. What else? So that's kind of prime. That's one kind of priming. Okay. And in this case, I'm thinking that that a prior articulation is more likely to influence subsequent articulations. And my reasoning is the following. Okay, we have all these things going on. So it seems that what is happening is that these Chinese origin participants are not recognizing the contrast in all these phonological contexts. In other words, they're not really recognizing the idea that we have pero, perro, pelo. It seems that everything becomes like one umbrella, group of articulations. Okay. All right. And so basically here they could say ya tiene familia, but in another instance they could also say no tiene familia. But the same person in another instance might say escuela. Okay. By the way, languages like Korean and Japanese have these in allophonic as allophones, those laterals and the taps. Okay, so a lateral will appear syllable initial, but here, what's the context? Do you remember? What's the context here? Between two, everybody say vowels. Between two vowels, that lateral can become a tap. Okay, I don't have example from Japanese or Korean, but there's that happening in Korean and Japanese. Okay, so priming is a cognitive mechanism by which prior articulation is more likely to influence subsequent articulations, and it's something that's used a lot in studies of linguistics. I'm only giving you examples from Spanish. Somebody may not be Spanish, but these are Spanish. That's a Spanish. It's also Spanish. But the first time I heard about priming was in a study by Poplack. It may not have been in the 1980s, but I heard it in a class, and they talked about Poplack. And basically, what she did is she was looking at plural expression in Puerto Rican Spanish, which I mentioned previously. Syllable final. I know I did not mention this, but Puerto Ricans, what she did is she looked at participants that were living in the US. I think she was looking at participants living in an area of Philadelphia, if I'm not mistaken. And she was looking at weakening of syllable final S. So S in Caribbean varieties and in other varieties of Spanish can weaken. So los gatos bonitos can become lo gato bonito, or even los gatos bonitos. So that's one difference between Caribbean Spanish and other varieties of Spanish. And so she was looking at the presence of a marker, a plural marker before the token, which favor retention of that token. So she was basically looking, or she was basically noticing that if an S appeared, it was most likely to trigger a following S. But if a deletion occurred, it was most likely to trigger a deletion. Following deletion. Okay, so that's a way of that's priming. And so there's some examples there from her study. Las cosas bonitas, la cosa bonita, etc. And then Travis, 2005, did a study, and she called this the yo-yo effect. The yo-yo effect. Basically, she's looking at priming in participants in Colombia producing subject pronoun expression. So in Spanish, we can say, como una hamburguesa, I eat a hamburger, or yo como una hamburguesa. Yo tengo 20 años, or tengo 20 años, right? Basically, what she was noticing is that a lot of the time when people say, yo no sabía, the next verb will be accompanied by a pronoun. In this case, she was only looking at first personal singular, yo. And so that's why she calls the yo-yo effect. Yo, 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 yo. Okay? It's not the yo-yo effect, but it's kind of similar as like a metaphor, right? Or yo-yo. And then another study, Sharon Nato was also looking at plural expression in Brazilian Portuguese, in the Northeast, and the same like Mexican, Caribbean Spanish, or in Spanish in general. Those are also varieties where you can produce or not produce the subject pronouns, okay? And she wrote a study called well, it was actually Schroeder and Naro. She wrote a study called Birds of a Feather Flock Together. Okay, she's talking about priming, okay? Okay, so these are from my data. Priming on target. What does on target mean? Is it correct or not correct? Are these correct articulations or incorrect articulations? What do you think? On target. Correct. Okay, correct. Y ahora mi papá ya está muy viejo, que nosotros nos dije que ya no va a trabajar, quedar en casa, so we have Roddick. Okay, so this is the beginning. There's no way I can measure the priming, right? It's the beginning, so there's no priming. It's a pause after a pause. So Roddick, 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 Roddick. That's the idea. Okay. No priming on target. No priming on target. Lateral, lateral, Roddick, lateral, Roddick, lateral, Roddick. So there's no priming there. There's no priming there, but they're on target. So this participant is, she got this right on target. Okay. There's no priming there. And then priming off target. So miles, that's on target. Kilómetros puede reunirse. Okay, so that's no priming. But these are off target, there's priming there. Okay. Entonces ellos pueden traer, so there's nothing, this is after pause. Pasaporte, hacer, trámite, entrar. So there's no priming there. Okay, there's no priming there. Okay, there was okay. No sé si entiende porque habrá. Okay. No, sí se entiende porque abra de Hong Kong es abra cantonesa. What's that? What's that in English? Or in Spanish? In habla. El habla de Hong Kong is habla cantonesa. But not on target, and there's no priming there, but there is priming there. Okay. No priming off target. So this is no priming, but off target. So la ciudad también habla. So no priming. Un poquito diferente. There's no priming. I have no space to put that, but there's no priming there. Habla, no priming. Okay, so that's happening there.
Can I ask a question about the example 4?
Yes, you can.
So the trámite interrupts this sequence, but I'm wondering if, because that R is in a different position, if there could still be some priming for entrar from the preceding essay where they're both
Yes,
worded fine.
I agree. I agree. Yes, so yeah, that's another type of priming, right? Because it's syllable final, whereas that's a cluster right there. But yeah, that's a good point. I mean, this is something that I'm just starting to look. So yeah, any comments, please? But yeah, that's a good point. And the other thing that I was thinking is can be also just lexical. Not in this case, but abra, for example, tends to appear as habla, tends to abra tends to appear as abra. Habla tends to appear as abra a lot. Okay, or problema tends to appear as purema, not porema, but purema. Also, so I mean, I'm thinking that there might be some type of lexical effect. Well, those are pictures. That's a picture of those are pictures of La Chinesca in Mexicali. It's a very old part of town. It's where Mexicali apparently started as a town. There are a lot of myths about La Chinesca. Like they say that there are tunnels under La Chinesca where a lot of illegal things tend to happen because the Chinese origin immigrants in this area of Mexico tend to be stigmatized a lot. There's a lot of stereotyping and a lot of ideologies about what being Chinese is. Okay, a lot of them don't identify as Chinese anymore, mainly because of the stigma that they want to get away from this. But other especially young Chinese have they're very proud to be Chinese and to continue speaking their L1. Okay, so it's a corpus-based approach, about 19 hours of L2 speech. 16 recorded conversations with 18 Chino Mexicanos. And I'm not using all the recordings because these are the only ones that I am using, because those are the only ones that speak Cantonese as an L1, okay, and who were born in China. I excluded the people that were not born in China, okay, because they don't speak Spanish as an L2. I mean, they have a lot of they speak Spanish as an L, pretty close to what's considered an L1, okay? And so remember that I was talking about the idea that in a lot of the representations that are done of these populations in Mexico, people tend to think that everything becomes lateralized, right? All these routics become lateralized. But mainly what I found is that only 15.8%, like about 16% of all the data was really off-target articulations, okay? Of all the liquids that I found, only 16% were off-target articulations. So the people are getting 85% of those articulations correct, right? But it seems that in the collective collective mind of the people in Mexicali and in Mexico in general, Chinese origin immigrants, the idea is that they tend to lateralize always. And the other thing is that they don't always lateralize, as you saw. So lateralization, canonical lateralization is the only possibility in these representations that I was talking about. But really what's happening in the data is that there's off-target laterals becoming tabs, there's tab becoming laterals, syllable finals becoming deletions, laterals, there's trills becoming retroflex, etc. So yeah, so it's really much more complex than just everything's going to become a lateral. Okay, I guess we would expect something like this in natural speech, right? And so how much priming was there? Well, about 54 of all the tokens that I found were priming. So one sound was triggering a similar sound in 54% of the time. Okay. If we start looking at on target and off target, I kind of separated. So how much priming is found in off target is about 51%, whereas on target, it's about 52%. So really, there's no big difference here. I mean, it wouldn't be a statistical difference. I haven't done any type of statistic yet, but I don't see any like big statistical differences yet, okay, here at least. I wanted to look a little bit closer into how it looks, this off target, on target, priming, no priming, with the different phonemes and the syllable final R. So with the erotics, there was priming, off target priming of 63% of the data, laterals 55%, and then the syllable final R 28%. So here I think is where there's a big difference here. Okay, there's a big difference here. And so this may be statistically significant, I don't know. But mainly what it tells us is that it's in the erotic where this is happening mostly. So pelo, okay, so perro becoming lateral, that type of stuff. I haven't really looked at different breakdowns, but it seems that they're having more problems with erotics. Okay. So once we look at only erotics, off target, on target, there's a lot of priming with the trill and the tap. There's a lot of priming. And the trill is the one that is getting the most priming. So more than likely the trill's becoming laterals, much more. But the tap's also becoming laterals, mainly laterals here, okay? Now, something that I did forget to talk about was this idea that, okay, so what's off target? What's becoming an off target articulation in this second language, Spanish, among Chino-Mexicanos? Well, mainly there's phonotactic problems and also syllable structure. So the phonotactic meaning that the sounds that do not appear in not found in the Chinese languages are the ones that are giving them more problems. That's the interference right there. And also syllable structures not found in the Chinese languages are the ones that are giving them more problems. So mainly what's happening is that the laterals are the ones giving them the less problem, then the syllable final, then the tap, and then the trill. So the trill is the one that is giving them the more problem. The trill is perro. This is perro. This is puerta. This is la. Escuela. Okay, so this is the one that's giving them much less problems. So you see it's 91% on target, 82% on target, 78% on target, 55% on target. So this is like less complex, more complex. Okay, and that also seems to be more or less what I found for the off-target priming, except here there's not a lot of difference anyway, but it was more likely that a target would, an off-target count would recur to priming. Okay, so yeah, that's kind of my conclusion. I haven't finished that, but that's kind of my conclusion. I don't know if you have any questions. Muchas gracias. It's a presentation that I will be doing in a conference pretty soon, so any ideas, any comments would really help. Any question that you have? You can ask me in Spanish or in English, not in Cantonese though.
Did you mention when you collected these recordings?
It's pre-pandemic.
Pre-pandemic? Okay.
And so through the pandemic, these were like there. Yeah. 2000 something. 18. It says I made different trips, so I was there 3 times. Yeah.
How long were you there for?
The longest was like 3 weeks. Yeah. And I worked with somebody called Professor Aullón, which was like the historian of the community. And he really helped me a lot because otherwise it would have been almost impossible. The people there don't have this idea of giving you 1 hour of their time because they're always working. There's this idea that I cannot give you 1 hour of my time because I need to work. And so only because I was working with Professor Ayón, the people agreed to stop for 1 hour of their time, give me 1 hour of their life to record them. But it's there's also the idea that, well, I mean, you have somebody coming from outside the community, what is he going to use that recording for? There's a lot of suspicion because after 9/11, the State Department classified the community, the Chinese community in Mexicali, as a problem, international problem for the U.S. Where at the time the idea, well, are you guys feeling me? It was. I mean, it became a problem. It was classified as a problem. They find anything like that. They have the best food, by the way, the best Chinese food. Yes.
Do they serve tortillas with their Chinese food?
It can be possible. Yes, it can be possible, depending on where, because you have like the old-fashioned restaurant, but they also have like this ones, like this is the old part of town, but you also have scattered more modern like US type buffets, yes, which are not as authentic, but a lot of people go there because, so this is where you might be able to find tortillas. These are people that might have been there since the early 1900s, or the restaurant belongs to the grandma, and now it's in the hands of the grandkids. There's also a lot of connection with the other side of the border, and with Los Angeles. So I was able to record people coming to Mexicali for the weekend, but living in Los Angeles and speaking Spanish like nothing. And then the other thing is that I found people in Calexico that only spoke Spanish. They didn't speak English, only Spanish, and they communicated in restaurants with customers in Spanish. I mean, this origin, Chinese origin people. So it's a very interesting dynamic, social dynamics. Yes.
Are there any other Chino Mexicano pockets in Mexico? And if so, why did you choose this community?
This is the most, I think this is the one that has a like longest lasting presence in Mexicali. I mean, people attribute the foundation of the city to the Chino Mexicanos. And that to me made it interesting. But there are Chinescas in Mexico City, and that's been there for a while. But it's very touristy. I don't think it's the same here. You're not going to find like hordes of people going there. I mean, you find people from Mexicali going to the restaurants, but it's not like in Mexico City where people go as part of their tour, away tour. And so there's pockets in Chihuahua City, but a lot of these people are integrating into Mexican society, and they're not really recognizing Chinese origin. Like, for example, here I found people, students in my Spanish classes, like I found people named Wong, Lam, Shang. But when I talked to them and said, is this Chinese? Is this Chinese? I shouldn't, but sometimes I do that. I said, do you have any Chinese origin? And some of them say like, no, don't talk to me about that. I don't want to know about that, because the thing with the Chinese migration is that it came through the port. Okay, it came through the port. So the people here in this area came through Tampico from Cuba, because a lot of Chinese coolies were taken to the Caribbean after the abolition of labor in Cuba. And so they replaced African origin workers in Cuba and in other parts of the Caribbean. And so Cuba also has like a sizable population, but most of it has integrated into the population. Okay, if you go to there's a Chinese restaurant right here on University. It was owned by a Chinese family. I don't know if it's there anymore, but they have very good shufa, which is what they call the Chinese food in Cuba. Shufang. And so yeah, but mostly in Mexico, they have integrated something that was common in Mexico City, like at the early 1900s, was the cafés de chinos, and it was really coffee shops owned by Chinese, but not necessarily serving Chinese food. It was just serving bread, coffee, and regular Mexican food. But you can still find some cafés de chinos left in Mexico City and in other parts of Mexico. Yes. But they were the largest immigrant community in the early 1900s. Do you have a question?
So you mentioned that with people who have Mandarin or Cantonese as a second language, that the distinctions between words like fellow and pero aren't really there because those sounds don't quite exist in their language. I was wondering that since Mandarin and Cantonese are very tonal-based languages with a different tone mean different things, and you rely on context a lot of the time, if those distinctions don't exist because they don't need to, because they can figure out from context because they're used to doing that in their language, is there a link there?
Not speaking Mandarin or Cantonese, it will be hard to determine, but I'm sure it's something that could be. But the other thing is that they're not exclusively monosyllabic, but they're highly monosyllabic. So that's also something there. But I mean, it's a hard question. But something to make me think, right? Something to make me think, yeah. And I don't know if I can even analyze that. I don't know, but thanks. We have 5 minutes.
Yeah. Other questions? I guess the question I would ask, I mean, it wasn't really what you were focused on. It's kind of, so in this priming, it's like speakers are like priming themselves, right? So once they do something, then they might repeat it.
Yeah.
Would you expect, I know it's not what you were looking at, but would you expect, or do you also get like speakers priming each other across speakers? So if one speaker, if they were talking and one dropped an R or something, the other one might.
I mean, it's been done. It's been done. A lot of the syntactic studies do that. I thought it was very hard here. I thought it was very, very hard here, but to do with phonology, but certainly has been done with interviewer participant in other studies looking at syntax like pronouns. Yes. Yeah.
And then I guess another question I'll ask is, I don't know exactly how to phrase it, but there's been a lot of like, throughout the history of Spanish, it seems like there's been quite a bit of, I mean, you're mentioning the dialect differences, but there's also like been like instability in L's and R's and things, right? Like tree turning from audible into audible and things like that.
But that is, yeah.
You're right.
Yeah.
So,
but mainly because I mean there were one group of sound. There's a lot of interrelation between laterals and rhotics. So yeah, and not only in Spanish, but also like I said, in Korea and Japanese, other languages, yes, that have those two sounds. Yeah. There's also those interrelations, yes. And then the other thing is that that even though Spanish is a tactically you can have complex syllables and also closed syllables. Those are very unstable as well. So it also helps with what's going on here. But more surprisingly, I think that especially for pedagogical implications, first these people are getting most of their articulations correct. So we can expect this in the classroom, hopefully. And then we can focus on certain areas of their speech if we want to correct some of these, target some of these phonological contexts that are, I mean, I don't know what to do with priming there.
Yeah.
Pedagogically, but I don't know. maybe give them flashcards with.
We're going to practice with, Eric on Eric.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank
Gracias.
you. Thank you.
Y'all want to take some to go?